Friends, welcome here. My name is John Martins, the Director of the Center for Christian Engagement. I want to begin the evening first by bringing up Dr. Jerry Turcotte, Principal of St. Mark's College and President of Corpus Christi College, to welcome you.
Thank you, John. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to welcome all of you here this evening in person and online, and especially to welcome Dr. Niigaan Sinclair to our campus. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded ancestral territories of the Coast Salish people, and in particular of the Musqueam Nation, and we thank them for the opportunity to work and to study and to grow together. I'd like to thank the Advisory Committee and especially the Center for Christian Engagement's Director, Dr. John Martins, not just for organizing this important and topical event, but also for the significant program of groundbreaking conversations, conferences, podcasts that they have been able to organize since the Center's founding. Tonight is another example of the critical conversations that it champions, and this evening's event is a testament to our commitment to asking the important and of course, the difficult questions of our time. Many years ago, as past chair of the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities in Canada, I had the honor of editing the first report of all the initiatives and commitments that the nation's Catholic post-secondary institutions were engaged in to champion reconciliation. That report was symbolically presented to Senator Murray Sinclair in Ottawa, who reminded us that reconciliation was a journey that would be hard to undertake, but absolutely integral to our creation of a just society. My colleague, Dr. Chris Adams, Rector of St. Paul's College at the University of Manitoba, recently edited the second edition of the report that demonstrates how far the Catholic colleges and universities have come in championing our commitment to reconciliation, but more importantly, how critical it is for us to continue to press forward and to do more, to ask difficult questions, even if, and often if, it uncovers difficult truths. Tonight, I hope it will be acceptable if I present a copy of this report to you, Dr. Sinclair, certainly in part as a symbolic continuation of that first step that we took, but more importantly as a sign that the Catholic colleges and universities in Canada and Corpus Christi and St. Mark's colleges here in Vancouver are committed more than ever to championing this dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for being here tonight, and Dr. Sinclair, thank you for prioritizing this important conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Turcotte. Thank you for traveling to be with us on our beautiful campus, even though we got some strange weather. I want to welcome all of you who are here in person for this lecture, and thank you for being here on the land of the Musqueam people. And I want to welcome all of those who are watching this lecture all over Canada this evening. This includes friends from the Archdiocese of Regina, the Archdiocese of Winnipeg, students from St. Paul's University in Ottawa, friends from St. Jerome's University in Waterloo, and the parishioners at St. Anne Catholic Church in Osoyoos, BC, who have gathered as a community to watch this lecture. This is wonderful. I'm so pleased that people from across Canada have joined the CCE for this important gathering at St. Mark's College. I also want to offer gratitude for the people who allow this kind of lecture to take place, the Cullen family who support us financially so that we can bring in speakers from all across Canada, significant speakers like Dr. Niigaan Sinclair, Peter Bull, Angus Reid, and Andy Zox, who have donated the monies that allowed the center to be formed and to do this work. We are thankful for them. Now let's get to the reason we've gathered Dr. Niigaan Sinclair. Dr. Niigaan Sinclair is a Anishinaabe, St. Peter's Little Peguis, and a professor at the University of Manitoba, where he holds the Faculty of Arts Professorship in Indigenous Knowledge and Aesthetics in the Department of Indigenous Studies. He was educated at the University of Winnipeg, a wonderful university, at the University of Oklahoma, and did his PhD at the University of British Columbia. He's an award-winning writer, editor, activist who was recently named to the Power List by Maclean's magazine as one of the most influential individuals in Canada. And in 2018, he won the Canadian Columnist of the Year at the National Newspaper Awards for his biweekly columns in the Winnipeg Free Press. A former secondary school teacher, he won the 2019 Peace Educator of the Year from the Peace and Justice Studies Association, based at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. You've probably seen him on CTV or CBC or APTN or in newspapers such as The Guardian. His first book is coming out soon. You might want to take a note of this. Winnipeg, Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Center, May 28th. May 28th, coming soon. Pope Francis came in July of 2022 to Canada on a historic visit to apologize for the Catholic Church's role in residential schools and answer the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Every night of the visit, Dr. Niigaan Sinclair was a voice on national and international media documenting the visit and the 4 steps the Pope modeled to evoke reconciliation in the Catholic Church in Canada. And this evening, he's here with us. This is good. Good for us. Good for our church. It's my great honor to introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Niigaan Sinclair.
Okay. Bonjour, everybody. Bonjour, Ndebe Magadaduk, Niigaan Webedum, Indigenous Cost, Namago Shindo, Damni Menwenda Momayayan. It's nice to be here. It's nice to be back at University of British Columbia because this is one of my alma maters, so I'm very close to this place. And I really appreciate you making this place look just like Winnipeg for me, if you could do. So I really appreciate that. It's freezing out there. Like, I came out to Vancouver because I thought, oh, I'll bring some shorts and I'll walk around with some shorts. No, apparently not. It's lovely out here. It's lovely to be here. I've been here for about a day. Got in last night, and I don't want to waste too much more time sort of telling you a little bit about myself, but I care a lot about this place, and I care a lot about the church. And so I want to say miigwech for having me, and I want to say miigwech and think about my great-grandmother and my grandmother who are kind of reminding me constantly, like, hey, this is your home too. And so it's nice to be here. It's nice to be welcomed in. As much as I am a Medewan, I'm a person who was raised in the lodge. I'm also a person who was created in many ways by the church. I'm going to talk a little bit about that shortly. I've got lots of different things I want to cover for tonight, so I'm going to try to be as efficient as I can, but I'm also going to be kind of aware that we can't cover 500 plus years of history in one talk, and I'll do the best that I can. But the important thing I think to mention is that in the work that I do, I am constantly reminded of our interdependency, of the ways in which we rely on each other, and that we have intricately woven lives that touch upon each other in ways that we both see and unsee. Here's an example. So both of my matriarchs of my family, from my Indigenous side and from my non-Indigenous side, are deeply, deeply invested in the survival and continuance of the church. And I was raised in the church in many different ways, either physically in a structure, or in the ideology of the church itself. And probably the most influential person was the person that I knew, a person that I spent much time with, which was my mother's mother, Janine Gamache, who is a French-Canadian woman who comes from France and Quebec, ended up in the Pas, Manitoba, was a French speaker, and spent most of her life raising her children to be very proud to be part of the Catholic Church. And so when she passed on in the final years of her life, she made it a real mission for herself to just show us the love and the kindness that she had learned from her time in the church, and that she was so dedicated to that time. I knew Janine, my grandma. I knew her. I was there right beside her when she passed and she took her final breath. The person I didn't know, but the person that I think has influenced me just as much, if not more, is my great-grandmother. Her name is Catherine Simard, and she is an Anishinaabe from Manicotagan. She is a staunch, strong, incredible woman that I never had the opportunity to know, and that she died at the birth of my Uncle Buddy, which was my dad's brother. the final child of a four-child family with my grandfather, and with my great-grandmother, who then was the parents of my grandparents. But Catherine Simard, she had an experience at the Fort Alexander Residential School as being a Catholic and as a daughter of a French fur trader, so that she, whose name is Louis Simard. There was a tradition in Manitoba that the children of Catholics, and particularly Indigenous Catholics, one of those children would be dedicated to the church. And so amongst many children that Louis had, it was my great-grandmother, Catherine, who was chosen by the family to be dedicated to the church. And so she was put into residential school like most Anishinaabe in Fort Alexander or Saging, and she spent her whole life in residential school. Now, this is where the story gets interesting. Because she could cook, the nuns took a liking to her. And what that meant is that she got to live with the nuns and be under the protection of the nuns in Fort Alexander Catholic Residential School. Now, for those of you that don't know about what happened at Fort Alexander Residential School, it is one of the most brutal schools in the entire country. It is the school that Phil Fontaine in 1990 came out on the news to say this was the place that I was physically and sexually abused virtually every day of my life in those walls. It is also the place that Ted Fontaine wrote about in his book. It is also the place in which dozens upon dozens of survivors have come forward to talk about the trauma that happened in the school while students attended. My great-grandmother, though, Catherine, was not one of those individuals. Whether she experienced the abuse, we don't know, but she certainly didn't come out with the kind of experience that would be a negative experience, because she felt protected and loved and cared for by the nuns at Fort Alexander. Because of her experience, because of her perhaps lesser experience of trauma than the prototypical student who attended Fort Alexander, she inhibited a kind of appreciation for the church that permeated throughout my family. And that when my father was given up by his father because of my grandfather's trauma, losing his wife, returning from the war, having attended that same school, Fort Alexander Residential School, for only 3 years, and having been physically and sexually abused by the individuals who worked there, who attended there, my grandfather gave up his own children and handed my father, Senator Murray Sinclair, the person who was in charge of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to Catherine. And through Catherine, my father was raised in the church. He was raised to appreciate the church. He was raised to not see the church in an oppositional, trauma-producing institution, but that he was able to see the church in the ways in which some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight when we talk about returning to Galilee, the kind of love that Jesus espouses by talking about the mission of the church. And that's the story of my father. So do you know why we have Senator Murray Sinclair? Do you know why we have the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also the very first Indigenous judge in Manitoba history, second in Canadian history? It's because of my great-grandmother knew how to cook. That's how fluky it is. That is how much of a absolute miracle that you get my father. It's not because he's remarkable or touched by some kind of skill or ability. He is all of those things, but no more than any other Indigenous person. The reason that you get a Murray Sinclair is because of a fluke. A fluke. And because my grandmother was able to bring my father up in such a way that he both got traditional teachings, Medewan teachings, but he also saw the church in a way that might be different than those who had experienced physical, sexual abuse, who rightfully so mistrust the church and know that the church could not protect children or did not protect children, and that you get a Murray Sinclair. I want you just to imagine how many Murray Sinclairs there could have been without that system, without that schools. And that's really what tonight is all about. What I want to talk about tonight is what the Pope invites us to do, what Pope Francis invites us to do, which is the most remarkable invitation of love and kindness that I could have ever experienced in my life, and having covered it in the media, but also feeling it in my heart. Not as a Catholic, I'd say maybe as a Medewan, as an Anishinaabe, but as a person who is deeply tied and invested in your work as a Catholic. And I'm going to make a call tonight to you as a Catholic. I'm going to ask you to do something at the end, and it is to be the most Catholic you can be. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. When we talk about the Catholic Church's role and responsibility with Indigenous communities, like, where do you start? But probably the most pertinent and critical area to start is the 1550 Valdeloid debates, which take place 58 years after so-called contact. When does European contact happen? I don't know, watch Curse of Oak Island if you want to know, if you know what I mean by that, right? When does that happen? But the doctrine of discovery really is birthed in three declarations by the Pope. And they are the Dum Dervasis, the Romanus Pontifex, and the Inter Cetera. And in 1452, Pope Nicholas V says that basically that when Christians encounter non-Christians, you can simply take their land. They are enemies of Christ. They're savages. They're Saracens. They don't deserve to live. And Pope subsequently followed that declaration by the Pope, that papal bull, that non-Christians are inferior to Christians. And that is what creates the doctrine of discovery, the notion that non-Christians have no rights to land, have no real right to live, and absolutely have no right to exist anything beyond to be servants, to be simple. And that's what creates the domino effect of, for the most part, the next 500 years, which I'll go through in just a minute. But in 1550, there is a court trial in a place called Valdeloid, which is why it's called the Valdeloid debates. And it's between Sepulveda and Bartolome Las Casas. Now, Las Casas had experienced life in the so-called New World. Sepulveda had not. Sepulveda had simply all to work on was the papal bulls, which was that non-Christians were inferior. And what the debate in the Valdeloid debates in 1550 was, are Indigenous peoples human? And of course, at the time, there was conquest, there was exploration, and empire building taking place. And so there was deep investments within the church, but particularly kingdoms, and I say kingdoms literally, over the possession of land globally. And of course, fights between Spain and Portugal, England, France, et cetera, et cetera. And as the conquest of the world continued, there was a great deal of investment within the question of what are the rights of Indigenous peoples. Now, the answer at that point in front of the Pope in 1550 was not to have an answer. The answer amongst the debates between Las Casas and Sepulveda was that the Pope could not decide. The determination was, well, we shall try to convert them, and we will see if they can be converted, if their humanity can be exposed when exposed to the Word of God. What I just said there is critical to remember for what the papal visit was all about. Remember what I just said there in the debate between in 1550. Remember, no decision was made in 1550. Now, for me to go through all the different history moments, the doctrine of discovery created in the 16th century is like a domino. It domino effects throughout the entirety of time. And for the next 500 years, we see the impact of that. Particularly the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is probably the strongest manifestation of that, which is when King George III, that's the famous king from the Hamilton musical, who then declares that all the land in North America up to the Rocky Mountains, which is why the modern treaty process is here, because he didn't claim the lands on the other side of the Rocky Mountains, but all the lands, that's my lands from Manitoba, from Treaty 1, etc., all of those lands were his. The reason he declared that was because he could. He defeated the French in the 7 Years' War, 1763. Boom. because he had a crown on his head, because he was bequeathed by God to be the representation of civilized humanity, I can claim all of the lands in North America. And yes, I'll give title, right? Those lands where Indigenous peoples are, they own it according to the ways that I frame ownership. And ultimately, that when I arrive, it's a price of my declaration because I'm the king and you must sell it to me. That's what creates the entire treaties 1 through 11, all the pre-Confederation treaties, and the whole notion that you have to give annuities, gifts, payments for lands in the first place. So for Europeans, land treaties are basically land purchases, but for Indigenous peoples, it's quite different. It's quite opposite to that. In fact, they are family-making vessels. But that's where we get the doctrine of discovery reverberating throughout history of Indigenous deficiency, which ultimately then leads into Confederation, Section 9124. The federal government will take in control of Indians and lands reserved for Indians. We are the only group that the federal government controls legislatively. And then, of course, the worst manifestation is the Indian Act. Cue residential schools, cue the control of dress and movement, cue the 60s scoop, child welfare. You know, every single thing you see today comes from the doctrine of discovery. Absolutely everything. The doctrine of discovery is the first domino of every single issue of poverty, over-incarceration, murder, missing Indigenous women and girls. Every single thing can be traced directly back to the papal bulls of the 16th century and the doctrine of discovery, which is why Indigenous peoples are so passionate about it, because it is that particular method that has led us to the most devastating policy in Canadian history, which is the residential school period. Now, to go through the residential school period, we don't want to get into too much history lesson, but the residential school period is not a moment. It is a series of moments in which laws were instilled to forcibly remove children for the purposes of assimilation. Starts in about 1831. For the purposes, because in the 1830s, there's starvation happened after the War of 1812, particularly in Upper and Lower Canada, and it's Indigenous peoples who ask for schooling with residency, with a sense of food. Why? Because lands are being flooded out by squatters, aka settlers, who are coming in, refugees from the War of 1812, and the British Empire through the British government through the Royal Proclamation are quickly just claiming Indigenous lands, throwing some money, a few pennies here and there, and saying, oh, now we own the land and we forcibly move. And the cost of that is Indigenous death to the tune of 90%. A virtual genocide takes place not through perhaps overt war, although that certainly happened with conflict, but it was more through a flooding out of territory, interruption of food lines, and ultimately, the biggest lie I was ever told in my life was that we were somehow susceptible to European disease. That's a lie, and it's never been true. We are susceptible to starvation, though. Starvation leads to sickness. And that is the key of understanding that big lie that you were told in school, that I was told in school, and somehow our immune systems were deficient is a lie. But we absolutely had poor immune systems when we were starving. And that's the key thing to understand, is that that particular moment then leads us to residential schools. And that residential school system was never meant to be an indoctrinating, assimilative, exterminating system, but it was interpreted to be that through the doctrine, because Indigenous deficiency. It's the same conversation between Sepulveda and Bartolome Las Casas all the way back to the Valdeloid debates. Are Indigenous peoples human? The decision of that court trial was, we will try to convert them. And that's where the residential school system is birthed, all the way until 1996, when the last school closes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's something that really critical that happens in 2009, because way before the TRC, although the TRC was in the process of negotiation, the residential school settlement agreement happens in 2006. There is a kind of moment, and it happens right after the Harper apology. And there's an invitation by Pope Benedict to a very small segment of AFN leaders. And it was not just that Harper would apologize, which was part of that settlement agreement, because remember that the federal government was going to be found guilty by the courts of the extermination of children, or the assimilation of children, certainly the cultural harm of children. Whether the term genocide would have been used in 2006 would have been questionable. But then that held the federal government to account, who then joined with First Nations, Inuit, Métis leaders to put pressure on the church, and that's what resulted in the 2009 Statement of Sorrow by Pope Benedict. Now, that Statement of Sorrow was genuine, and it was something in which was held at the Vatican in a private room. It was not public. As you can see, at then National Chief Phil Fontaine, who accepted the Harper apology, attended that with a number of First Nations delegates. And I don't know if you can see this right here. That is Tobasanequit Canoe. That is now Premier of Manitoba Wab Canoe's father, who was a part of that delegation. He was also a person who was very strong, very proud to be related to the Catholic Church as well. Now, the reason I tell you this is because why didn't it end there? Like, why wasn't this enough? Why wasn't the Statement of Sorrow enough? Well, a number of the reasons why that is. One, it wasn't public. Number two is it didn't include members of all First Nations, or particularly organizations that were inclusive to First Inuit and Métis particularly, but I would also say other First Nations, because not all First Nations are a part of the Assembly of First Nations or certainly feel connected with that. And absolutely, it's done in the Vatican. That's not good enough. It's not good enough to mail in your sorry. It's critical that where the harm took place for Indigenous peoples, that we return to the space, because it is not just about people, it's also about the earth, it's also about non-humans, and particularly it's about those who have been most impacted. Because it's not about, and this is a critical moment for you to understand of the difference between Canadian justice, or we'll say Western justice, and Indigenous justice, is that it must be public. It must be shared. Harm is not between the harmer and the harmee. It's about who witnessed the harm, who was impacted by the harm. And then most importantly, now that we have all collectively experienced harm, what are we going to do about the harm collectively? And that's the problem with the Statement of Sorrow. And that's why the Pope has to come to Canada. And that's why in the TRC, the number one thing the TRC heard was that survivors said, we need to see the Pope. Now, at that time, of course, now we see a new Pope, so Pope Francis is coming in, 2015, the end of the TRC. We have a moment in Ottawa where the final report is given to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister comes up on stage and says, I commit to implementing all 94 calls to action. I'm in the room watching my father and the other commissioners of the TRC, and I turn to my sister after I hear the Prime Minister's words and I say, holy smokes, that means the Indian Act is over. Well, it turns out that the Indian Act is still here. So that tells me that the Prime Minister was either over-ambitious or implementing the 94 calls to action can't be done in a weekend. Now, Call to Action 58 calls on the Pope to come to Canada to face survivors and to offer to those survivors, notice that it says First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in Catholic-run residential schools. Because the TRC was not about First Nations only, even though the government framed it to be a First Nations issue, it was also about Inuit and Métis peoples. And so it was meant to be, from the very first moment, from the TRC's point of view, about all Indigenous peoples. Every single Indigenous person who was impacted by those schools, because we know that First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples attended those schools collectively. We know it didn't matter when the Indian agents showed up, whether you were First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, that they took you anyways. And that's what led us to 58. But notice that it says, this was released in 2015, and it says, within 1 year. So by 2016, we should have seen the Pope in Canada, right? Well, turns out there's two arguments. One is the Vatican says, we already did this already. We did the Statement of Sorrow already. And second is, this is a Canadian issue. This is not our issue. The Canadian bishops have to take responsibility for this. By this point, the Anglicans have apologized, the United Church has apologized, and the Presbyterians have apologized. Those are the ones who ran about 30% of the schools. The Catholic Church has run 70% of what's recognized as residential schools. And this is something in which the Canadian Council of Bishops tried, perhaps, in some way, to recognize their role and responsibility, but it was clear that the Vatican was not interested in moving until this happened. Oh, you know what? Terrible segues when it doesn't work that way. Then you're just like, what's going on? There we go. Until this. We do not get Pope Francis's visit until the activists, the researchers, the academics, the communities come together to talk about the unmarked graves at residential schools. Without the issue of unmarked graves, the Vatican probably doesn't take this seriously because they absolutely don't see the global impact of the worldwide headlines that the finding of unmarked graves at residential schools impacted. And I want us just to think about that a little bit. I want us to think a little bit about why is it that the Canadian Council of Bishops, the public, the Canadian public, and everyday Catholics wasn't enough? Why is it that the global media pressured the Vatican in order to make a move on this and to have interest in what was to become Papal Visit 2022? And these are things that are worth talking about, because I also think that at this time, this became an issue and on the awareness that there was a problem to Pope Francis himself. And that perhaps Pope Francis, maybe due to the counseling he was receiving from his persons in the Vatican, maybe it might be that there's many different things to worry about when you're at the Vatican, but for one reason or another, this became a motion moment for the Church. And that's my another terrible segue. There you go. For some reason, for one reason or another, the Catholic Church begins to move in about 2017-18, and then finally in the tipping point of the discovery of 215 unmarked graves, potential unmarked graves, in 2020 during the pandemic, and the worldwide cacophony for the next 2 years that takes place. That then creates a movement and interest and an announcement that the Pope invites First Nations, Inuit, and Métis leaders to the Vatican, and that's where I become involved. Oh, darn it. Okay, I am doing this. Yeah, screw that. Okay. And that's where in, the announcement that in May of 2022, this is actually a little bit more, we're going to talk a little bit about what are the 4 steps of what Pope Francis invites us to do, and particularly what we are invited to do as Catholics, as Canadians, as Indigenous peoples, working together in this interwoven relationship within this country. And I'm going to talk about what I call to be the 4 gifts. So the visit doesn't actually begin in July 22, it actually begins in May. It begins with the first announcement months before at the Vatican in this very pivotal room, in this visiting welcoming room in the Vatican that you can see discovery in the background, in which First Nations, Inuit, and Métis leaders join together to invite each other in the very room that banned indigeneity, that framed indigeneity as deficient, in the room that celebrates discovery. This took place.
Here at the heart of the Roman Catholic Church, a moment that some describe as divine. Inside the Vatican, before an audience of about 200, including bishops, Indigenous delegates, and their supporters, the Pope delivered a powerful message few saw coming. Following prayers and Indigenous performances, Pope Francis said he felt sorrow and shame for what happened at residential schools.
In particolare con responsabilità educativa.
He also acknowledged the damage and indignity visited upon Indigenous children by some members of the Church, though he stopped short of saying the Church itself was responsible.
E mi unisco ai fratelli vescovi canadesi.
I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry.
Later outside, the impact of those resounding words.
Today is a day that we've been waiting for, and certainly one that will be uplifted in our history.
Pope Francis seemed to commit to a July visit to Canada. That it happened now shocked many.
Were you expecting to hear an apology today?
Not to the extent that we received, and then it was really, really moving.
At least we now have one of the main perpetrators of colonization and of the residential school system upon our people on record apologizing for what they did, and that is very powerful.
But the Inuit leader said the Pope's words won't satisfy everyone. Still, St. Peter's Square was filled with a sense of empowerment in the air and an expectation of more.
I'd like him to speak with our survivors and our family members and to our youth back home, because that's also important. And to do it on our land in our ways is I think, as maybe even more important. So I think it's hearing him say those exact words, I am sorry.
Juanita, you mentioned July. What more do we know about the timing of the Pope's visit?
Well, Ian, the Pope said today that he would like to come to Canada really soon. He said that he doesn't want to come during a cold Canadian winter, and that he would like to come when they're celebrating the Feast of St. Anne, which is on July 26th.
Feels like a Vancouver winter day right now in Rome. You've been our lead reporter through the week, and what have your reflections been?
Well, Ian, it's been wonderful to see fellow Nunavummiut here in Rome representing Inuit like David Sekwak, the Inuk drummer, and Marty and Lizzie Angutialuk from Coral Harbor. They sang an Inuktitut song in front of the Pope today. I don't think that's ever been done before, but really it's been a real honor to be able to share stories and tell those stories to our audience, and that's been a real honor for me.
Well, it's been great working with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
In the very room in the very building, in the very institution that band our cultures, languages, traditions, dress, are very foundational in being the remarkable groups that went over that had no reason to trust that anything would be different, did so and danced and offered stories and gifts. It is remarkable the demonstration of love that our peoples had in relation to an institution that in many ways had not reciprocated that for 500 years. And it is a remarkable, remarkable demonstration of peace. Like, name me a time in history where a people who had experienced genocide faces those who perpetrated the genocide, and they danced and sang and listened to each other. The only other ones I can possibly display to you is maybe truth commissions in Australia, Rwanda. Nuremberg doesn't really come close. There is something remarkable that began this visit, and it began in May 2022. And it really began with gifts. The notion of gifts. I want you to think about what gifts is. That Indigenous peoples are offering that gift. And that gift of time, patience, and understanding for waiting 500 years to be recognized simply as human beings, as people who, in languages, cultures, dress. And that it took 500 years for an institution to accept people on their own terms. Now, I'm going to get to the apology in just a minute, but I want you to think about gifts for just a minute, because that's really what the Vatican visit was all about. The Pope offering the gift of, I will come to your territory, and it is Indigenous peoples who offered different specific gifts. A stole by the Assembly of First Nations. The Métis National Council gave a book of their experiences because they had been left out of much of the processes of the church that the Catholic Church had set up within Canada. And certainly First Nations had gotten the lion's share of attention. Métis wanted to offer that story. And that the Inuit gave the most land-based gift. They gave a cross carved from a baleen of a bowhead whale and a pouch made from sealskin and an ivory button. The delegations also gave to the Pope 2 pairs of moccasins, which were representative of the children who attended those schools, and most importantly, gave the gift of a mission, a test, as it were, or maybe a lesson for the Pope to say, you must carry these until we see you again. Now, what did the Pope offer? He also offered a gift. It was an olive branch, and this is where my biblical scholarship kind of is at the surface, but I do the best that I can. I'm going to talk a little bit about Darren Diaz in just a minute, Father Diaz, and the tutelage that he's given to me. Of course, the olive branch comes from the story of Noah, and when Noah saw that dove or crow or whatever the story, the elements of that olive branch that's within the beak is a reminder of the land that is yet to be seen, the land that we can all stand on. And so by offering an olive branch to Indigenous peoples, it is the Pope through his own language of the church, just as Indigenous peoples are offering the gift of the language that they are offering through their cultures, traditions, and laws, of the offering of that land that we can stand on together. And what is the land that I'm talking about? It's the visit. The visit is the territory that we will share for the next few days and between the papal visit of July 2022. This is what happened on the very first visit, or the very first day in July of 2022, when the Pope came to the former site of the residential school at Musqueam and held a gathering.
An act of contrition. Pope Francis praying over the graves of generations. Lives cut short, say survivors, by the residential school the Roman Catholic Church ran at this site.
It is a blessing to receive and host you. You have traveled a long way to be with us on our land and to walk with us on the path of reconciliation.
That path leading the pontiff to a display of the culture the church tried to extinguish, along with the names of more than 4,000 children who either died or never returned.
I am deeply sorry.
Pope Francis built on his initial apology, saying the church cooperated with governments to carry out policies of forced assimilation.
Sorry for the ways in which, regrettably, many Christians supported the colonizing mentality of the powers that oppressed the Indigenous peoples.
After the apology, this moment of raw emotion, the Pope's mere presence reopened wounds.
I just feel really disappointed, really let down. But I wanted to hear, on behalf of the Catholic Church, I apologize for residential schools and for all of the atrocities that happened. And I didn't hear that.
But others found comfort in the Pope's words.
I think they were powerful. They were powerful. I think it came from the heart. So I'm happy with that.
A long time coming in their healing journey.
I'm blessed that I was able to go through what I went through and to be able to survive. And
the Pope returned 2 pairs of moccasins given to him in Rome, a pledge to keep walking toward reconciliation. Before he left, the crowd erupted as the Pope was given a traditional headdress to wear by the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner who invited him.
So Olivia...
just because I'm going to cut that little part at the end there. Okay, everyone wants to talk about the headdress. I'll talk about that in a second. There's 2 really critical things. The first is that the Pope clearly was listening, because he listened to understand what the nature and the law of Indigenous peoples are, which is that when a gift is offered, you return that gift. That's what the word miigwech means in our language as an Anishinaabe people. The word miigwech it comes from the verb miigwe, so that when you are offered something, you are expected to offer something back. So gifts are a law. They are about familial kinship building between you and I, just like a handshake, that when someone offers you territory and space, you're expected to return something or bring food to the feast like a great potluck. The Pope clearly, on some level, understood his responsibility and his legal right, or his legal responsibility, by being gifted those moccasins. So he understood something that Indigenous peoples have been trying to tell Europeans, whether it be through the sharing of land, through territories, through the very nature that I am here tonight. the very nature of our relationship is always and will forever be based in gifts. That gifts are the law. And my question is Canada returned gifts? Have they ever returned gifts? And if they have, what are those gifts? Because Indigenous peoples have been given gifts for 500 years, almost perpetually. Gifts of time, patience, familial, kinship, territory, resources, time and time, patience, patience, patience. And we've been waiting for that gift to be returned. And seeing that moment of the moccasins then results in another gift-giving exercise, which is Wilton offering the headdress. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the apology in just a minute, but Wilton offering that headdress wasn't about the Cree people or Indigenous peoples or even Musqueam. That is about Wilton giving his personal headdress. It would be like offering a feather, offering a cup of water. It is a sacred item for Wilton, the commissioner of one of the commissioners of the TRC. That was not on behalf of Indigenous peoples. And so I don't, people want to get offended by that. In fact, I was on the news to say I'm sick and tired of sacred items being given to people randomly. It is about Wilton offering a moment of kindness and generosity to demonstrate to others really what this moment is all about. It is just like seeing a handshake. It's just like offering a glass of water. And so I've changed my stances slightly on that, in that it is something in which I think we should think deeply about giving our most sacred items, but at the same time, it is Wilton's headdress. It was his choice to do that. It was the commissioner's choice to do that. So think of it more as a demonstration than the altruistic kind of offering of the Pope is now a chief. Because only a community can do that, not an individual. Now, let's get to what is really remarkable about the headdress is that the Pope puts it on. Like, I've said to many times to people, what is the nature of what the Pope, or what is the importance of what a Pope should wear on their head? And there's two things. So there's two things that popes should wear on their heads, and a headdress is not one of them. So the idea that the Pope would take an item that has been gifted to him, and have you ever seen the way that royalty or leaders get gifts from people who come up and offer gifts? Well, oftentimes they put it to the side or they offer it to an assistant. In fact, this was the most Indigenous moment, I think, of the entire apology, which is that the Pope finished and then a bunch of grannies and grandpas and elders just rushed the stage. And if you see that moment, the Pope actually gets surrounded by security and he waves them away, which tells you, I think, a little bit about the Pope understanding the gravity of the moment. And you particularly understand that by him putting it on, which is equally, like Wilton offering it, a demonstration of kindness, generosity, and of what this moment really is. Because what did the Pope really say? I'm going to read a little bit to you. What he said was in his apology, "I am sorry. I ask forgiveness in particular for the ways in which many members of the church and of religious communities cooperated, not least through their indifference in projects of cultural destruction and forced assimilation promoted by the governments of that time, which culminated in the system of residential schools." I'm just going to highlight that part here, which I think is critical. "It is painful to think of how the firm soil of values, language, and culture that made up the authentic identity of your peoples was eroded, and that you have continued to pay the price of this. In the face of this deplorable evil, the Church kneels before God and implores his forgiveness for the sins of her children. I myself wish to reaffirm this with shame and unambiguously. I humbly beg forgiveness for the evil committed by so many Christians against the Indigenous peoples." Do you know what is the least indifferent thing that you could do? Put on a headdress. What the Pope said in this moment was the true evil is indifference. The indifference that all Christians experienced by being a part of the church, that the church has fostered, and most importantly, that every single Catholic carried over time and was conditioned to think of that. I'll give you an example. Remember Jeanine Gamache, my grandmother? She one time said to me, she said, "You know, Niigaan, I never really knew Indigenous peoples growing up." And I was like, "Grandma, you were in the paw. which is right beside a First Nation called Opaskwayak Cree Nation. They literally share the same name, Opaskwayak, the Paw. It's the same word. And literally there's a river that separates them. So 1,000 Indigenous peoples on this side, 1,000 French-speaking people on this side. You think they would interact a bit. And Grandma says, no, I never saw any Indigenous peoples at all. It's because on Opaskwayak, there was a residential school. That residential school was famously attended by a woman named Helen Betty Osborne. She was murdered by indifference and hatred of Indigenous women and girls. My grandmother said to me, oh, hold on, there was one time I saw Indigenous peoples. One day I was about 10 years old and I heard a knock at the back door, and there was 4 young Native girls there, and they were selling items that they had sewn at the residential school. And I didn't have any money, so I said sorry, and then they went along their way. And she said, now that I'm thinking about it, like, where were their parents? Like these 6, 7, 8-year-old girls that were at the back door, no older than my grandmother, where were their parents? And then I said, hey, Grandma, like, what do you think they were doing? We're trying to raise money for a school. Like, what do you think that was about? Anne Lindsay and Carly Saposnik Evans said, these are researchers from the University of Manitoba, did extensive research into show that the chronic underfunding of residential schools by the government and the church, or the misuse of funding by the Catholic Church to use the funds that were given to take care of children and to build the church in town, which then means the starvation of children, the chronic underfunding of the school to expand the Catholic role within towns and communities across Canada, resulted in fundraising attempts. And so children, by sewing and selling their items to fundraise for the school, that's called slavery. That's indentured slavery. And so my grandmother, before her very eyes, as a 10-year-old, was witnessing the Canadian version of slavery. That is right up there with plantations, that is right up there with the continued extortion and forced removal of people's funds and resources. That children were used to work 12 to 14-hour days, were doing laundry, working in fields, sewing, to raise money for a chronically underfunded school that was being misappropriated funds by the church. My grandmother never knew that. How could she know that? She was 10 years old. But one thing that she didn't do was ask questions. She was also told, never really ask a question, or never talk about this, or never talk about what happened within the church. And the Pope is saying that the problem ultimately is that every Catholic has been taught to be indifferent. Don't ask the questions. Accept that the leadership of the church knows what's best. And the biggest lesson, don't ever question that Indigenous deficiency or that we have to convert them. And that's the challenge here. By putting on the headdress, what Pope Francis was saying was Catholicism's got to be different. Something different's got to happen here. We got to start asking questions. We got to accept each other's gifts. And perhaps most of all, we got to ask the question of how did we get here? And this brings us to the doctrine of discovery. Do you know how many popes have rescinded the doctrine of discovery? Like, there was this whole thing during the papal visit of rescinding the doctrine. Like, why didn't the Pope come out and say, on behalf of the church, I rescind the doctrine, or on behalf of the church, I take responsibility? Well, here's why. You know how many popes have rescinded the doctrine? About a dozen. Do you know that the first pope to do it was about 1570? Because the genocide was taking place when Christians encounter non-Christians, Christians come in and kill everybody, and do that without any reckless abandon because they're not human beings anyways. And the Pope went, wow, this is absolutely antithetical to the teachings of Jesus, to the teachings of the church, and we have to do something. And so the Pope did some of the most the popes in over the next dozen popes did the most unlikely of things, disagreed with another pope, disagreed with the Romanist pontificus, disagreed with the notion that non-Christians don't have rights. And for decades, centuries, popes have tried to take responsibility on behalf of the church. And that tells you that it's not really about saying, on behalf of the church, I need to do this. It's about taking action. It's about putting the headdress on. And that's why it's important to rescind the doctrine and to do it a 13th time. And did you notice that when Pope Francis got very ill and was sent to the hospital and they were worried about his life, what he did? This was in November of 2022, I think, 2023. Just after the papal visit, he rescinded it again because he saw that it meant something to Indigenous peoples to rescind it again. But like we know that rescinding the doctrine doesn't do anything. It doesn't revert the land back. The fact that the Catholic Church is one of the biggest owners of stolen land in the country, you'd think that that would move the church forward, because almost every single church, every single institution, Catholic institution, is built on stolen land. And you'd think that would encourage the church a little bit to think about how do we get land back or return land. So if anything, we hope that that provokes that dialogue, but I think action means more than words, and that's where we would want the doctrine of discovery to end up. Which brings us to the Vespers, which is the third step of the visit. So what have we done so far? We've done the Vatican, which is the lesson of gifts, Indigenous-led ideas of law, and most importantly, will you return the gift that we have offered to you, which is our love and kindness, our dance, our culture? Will you return those kinds of kindness? Will you really bring the olive branch that we can walk on? And then there's the Pope's gift, which is the apology, and most importantly, the recognition that indifference is the problem, and that we need to put the headdress on to make sure that we can give each other gifts, try each other's food, learn from each other, show each other kindness and love. And there's no sound in this part, so you don't have to worry about that. You know, the Vespers is, I think, not every Catholic knows about Vespers, is my experience. And so do you all know what Vespers are, right? So some of you who are in the church, you know, but those of you who are not in the church and those of you who are online, the Vespers is when the church basically decrees how the church should go. And it tends to be led by leadership within the church, archbishops, in this case the Pope. It's within the center of the church in Canada, which is in Quebec City, which is the largest institution, kind of the home of the Catholic Church within the country. And what the Pope says at this visit is kind of just generally how things should go. This is the laws, this is the ways in which the church should proceed. Now, this is where I really want to give credit to my good brother, my mentor, a brilliant, wonderful man who is the reason I'm here today, because he's the person that introduced me to everyone here. It's Father Darren Diaz. Now, Father Diaz, who is one of my very close friends, we're working on an essay about this visit together. He reminds us that one of the things that was said during the Vespers was that the Pope said that he called on every Catholic to return to Galilee. And of course, we know the teaching of Galilee, which is that's where Jesus fulfilled the prophecy, began the teachings in which that would become those of love. And what the Pope says is that each one of us has our own Galilee, the place of the initial proclamation, the place in which we first heard the word, the place in which you first believed, the place in which you first knew that there was a bigger meaning to all of this. Remember that teaching, because the more I think about that, we need to rediscover this memory is a critical thing that Father Diaz reminds us. Remember that teaching around Galilee. But what the Papal Vespers, by the way, during my CBC coverage, I kept calling it Papal Visit, and the CBC never got so many emails about Niigaan Sinclair not knowing how to say Papal Visit. Here's what he said in Quebec City, and I think is one of the most powerful, remarkable things any pope has ever said in history in this continent, in Canada, anywhere globally. He says, "We are talking about living in a Christian community that in this way becomes a school of humanity where all can learn to love one another as brothers and sisters, ready to work together for the common good. Indeed, at the heart of the preaching of the gospel is God's love, which transforms us and makes us capable of communion with all and service to all. The church is called to embody this love without borders in order to realize the dream that God has for humanity, for us to be brothers and sisters all. Let us ask ourselves, how are we doing when it comes to practical fraternity between us? Bishop among themselves and with their priests, priests among themselves and with the people of God? Are we brothers or competitors split into parties? And how about our relationship with those who are not, quote, one of our own? With those who do not believe, with those who have different traditions and customs? This is the way to build relationships of fraternity with everyone, with Indigenous brothers and sisters, with every sister and brother we meet, because the presence of God is reflected in each of their faces." And that, my relatives, is the answer to the Valdeloid debates. It's over. It's done. Indigenous peoples are human. Indigenous peoples already, before Europeans even showed up, have the presence of God. And then when we dance, when we wear our traditional clothing, when we speak our languages, we are already reflecting God. That we don't have to convert in the ways in which conversion is imagined to be. The answer to the Valdeloid debates has arrived. And the popes declared it, and we know that with papal bulls, that the pope's job is to take the previous papal bulls and to then inform and push and imagine what the church needs in the future. And by calling on Catholics, he is giving you a road towards reconciliation, which most importantly is that it's not enough to expect Indigenous peoples to come to the church. It's the job of the church to go to Galilee, to go to the place of the first belief. And I want you to think back. Do you remember the first moment you realized there's something bigger in all of this? Like there is a God, or that you heard Jesus' message? What was it? Like, why does Jesus wash the feet? Why does Jesus be so dedicated to those who say terrible things? Why is it that Jesus gave up so much for all of us? It's love. It's that moment you felt love. That's Galilee. And that's what will show Indigenous humanity. That will show you that Indigenous peoples, in our cultures, traditions, languages, the same things that we showed in the Vatican in an institution that declared us as savage, inferior, and worth death, worth nothing more than death, that we do not belong to live because simply we think, act, be differently than others, and that we have love too. And that shows the relationship of God on our faces. But the visit isn't over, because the path of reconciliation now must have action. So the Pope actually goes to Galilee. And that's what Father Diaz argues, because what he says is that I want to go to the place in which I go from the center, Jerusalem, to the place in which I found love, or the place in which love is found, and he travels up north. Now, for those of you that know what is happening up north, residential schools are still happening there. Residential schools are still going on. There are still religious-run institutions in which children are forced to go to travel by air, often hundreds of miles away from their family, in which they don't see them. But it's not a government policy, it's a financial, it's a geographical, it's a ideological situation in which children are still being forcibly removed from their communities. And also the church has a very deep relationship with young people in the north. One of the things that Father Diaz points out is that there's a reason that the Pope goes from the center of Catholicism in Canada to the so-called margins. Because it is in the margins that we will find that those teachings of Galilee, those teachings, Jesus doesn't return to Jerusalem to be able to find his mission. He returns to Galilee to find that love. Now, my argument with Father Diaz is the north is the center, man. The north is the center of indigeneity, in which you see the most remarkable things, because the proportional population is still very high. If you go to Yellowknife, for example, the community is 40% Indigenous. So what does that mean? I was describing it when we had snacks earlier. You will see Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples working together, interwoven. You will see Indigenous peoples speaking and working with non-Indigenous peoples in their families. You'll see non-Indigenous people speaking fluently Inuktitut. You will see people who show love and demonstrate that love every single moment in the north. In fact, what I've always said is that the future of Canada will be in the north. It is in those examples of what reconciliation truly looks like, when people see each other as human beings, and it's found most often in the north. Down here, it's Winnipeg, which is what my book's about, May 28th, by the way. Right. And that's what the Pope does, is in this part of the visit, he goes to see and he offers that apology again, and he rediscovers that love. But then something else happens, which is the fourth part of the visit and the most unexpected one. So there's this thing that Father Diaz and other Catholic scholars point out, which is that when a Pope travels to a jurisdiction, it's the archbishop of that territory, or the leader of the church in that territory, that basically sets the guideline for what the Pope can and cannot say. Because the leader of that jurisdiction is the person who is the ultimate say on that territory. But when the Pope is in the plain, the Pope is free to give what's called the Sermon of the Plain. And somebody turns to Pope Francis on the plane as he's traveling from the north back to the Vatican, and he says, hey, so was it genocide? Is residential schools genocide? Now, if you can remember, back in 2022, there was still this debate in the country, was residential schools evidence of genocide? Even though in 2019, the Murder, Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry had issued that they are experiencing a current genocide that's taking place within the country. The Prime Minister accepted it, but the country still wants to debate of, is residential schools genocide? And the real debate is around mental intent. Did the country itself mean to kill children, exterminate children in a mental way? Because physically, the proof is absolutely there. The unmarked graves are one example. Like, how many schools have cemeteries beside them? Whether you want to talk about tuberculosis epidemics, whether you want to talk about outright murder that happened within the schools, or the fact that the children ran away from those schools because they were so terribly treated and that therefore died in those places. Those are all evidence of genocide, absolutely. But whether there's mental intent is often the debate. And the Pope looks out, and the Sermon on the Plain says, I asked for forgiveness for what has been done, which was genocide, and I did condemn this. To take away children, to change the culture, their mindset, their traditions, to change a race, an entire culture. Yes, I used the word genocide. 2 weeks later, the federal government unanimously passes that residential schools is genocide. Don't ever tell me the Catholic Church doesn't have power in this country and that the Pope doesn't have power. B, can we move on now? Can we recognize that the truth, and now what does it mean to ultimately carry that truth? How do we commemorate that truth? That's what I want to talk about. How do we put on each other's truths? When that gift is offered to us, what responsibility do we have now that we know the truth? How do we treat one another? How do we return those things that have been stolen? And most importantly, how do we see each other as human beings and maybe family? Because that's what treaties are supposed to do. That's what these nights like this is supposed to do. That's what us spending time together, sharing food, olive branches, stoles, gifts, languages, dance, that's what it's supposed to be, is to create family. So that your children and my children, or your grandchildren and my grandchildren, marry one day. That's what the purpose of all of this is that for us to live together, to love one another, and to create peace and prosperity for all. That's what the word kanata means. It means the village. It means everyone matters here. It means you matter, I matter, we are both home. That's what the Pope invites us to do. 4 steps. We must give each other gifts, but we must recognize that harms have happened and that we must take responsibility for those. And that is the ultimate gift. The ultimate gift is, how do we find olive branches that we can stand on together? What's the territory that we can stand? How do we interact with each other? And it begins in the most important gift of all, which is that we see that we each have a piece of God in us. That you have a piece of God and that I have a piece of God. And that you may go to the church and I may go to the lodge, but together we are both godly. Together we are both a part of Gije Manado, this incredible mystery of life that is undergirded, that is found the foundation of love. And it will be love how we will talk. Love will be what our goal will be. Love will be how we will look at each other and say, maybe we'll be family. Because if we do that, notice how easy the truth is. Like, isn't it remarkable how, like, this thing that people have been fighting over for decades, it's like the Pope just goes, yeah, it's genocide. That when we do the heavy lifting of love, the crazy idea that we both matter, that we're both human beings, and that we both have something to bring to the party, and that we try each other's food and clothing, and we listen to each other's dances and songs, and we see each other as human beings, that the truth is quite easy. And the truth is that we're all in this together. We're all in this together. And on a night like this, I hope I want to offer to you one more thing as I end off for tonight. As Pope Francis asks you, I want you to return back to that moment of love. Remember that first moment you believed? That first moment you felt it, right? I can't tell you what it is because you each had one differently. For me, it was the birth of my daughter. When my daughter was born, I realized something bigger was happening in my life, that there was something meaningful that I was a part of. And I also realized that when I lost a child in my life, that remarkable experience of both gaining and losing a child in my life, the teaching is the same, and it has to do with love and meaning. I want you to go back to that moment for you. What is it for you? Is it the moment when you experienced love or pain? Is it a moment in which you saw something or experienced something, watched an eagle fly across the sky, tasted a beautiful water for the first time? What is it that you experienced? And I want you to feel that love, and I want you to take that forward, because I'm calling upon each one of you to not turn away from the church, but to turn towards it. And what I mean is, I want you to be more Catholic than ever. Because that moment you were called to the church, the moment that you were called to hear Jesus, the moment that you were called to understand the Bible and to see it in a different way, to see it in the love way that you know it is, that is a document full of love and kindness and generosity, not the things that you maybe read on the media or that you see in social media or the things you hear about. Those things might not be the message of love. They might be indifference. I'm calling on each one of you to be more Catholic than ever, to go to Galilee, to be that place, to go to that place in which love is the foundation of how you move forward. And I think that will be the most Catholic thing you can do, because I learned it from two grandmothers. Two grandmothers taught me that. One Indigenous, one non-Indigenous. They taught me that through love, I can come to a place like this and talk about love. So with that, I say a big miigwech and thank you for your time. I'm happy to take some questions or comments. Thanks, everybody. Miigwech, everybody. Thank you. There's my email right there. I don't know if it's closed off or whatever. That's my email right there. So if you comments or questions, I like comments better than questions. I like hearing what people's feedback are. But that's my email right there. If you don't feel like comfortable, whether you're online or whether you're live here, you want to say something or you want to offer me some advice or some ideas on what you heard for tonight, there's my email. But I'll offer that over here. Go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Well, I don't pretend to be an expert on all things Catholic or what's going on within the church. Here's what I can say is that the Catholic Church has a consistent track record of disappointing. And that is frustrating because, for those of us who are working hard to try to talk to the church, advocate to help the church grow and change, and I consider myself one of those, it is frustrating to continually watch the church get in its own way. And to be the same old hierarchical, at times racist, at times sexist, highly divisive, but I also think things don't change overnight. right? And so that tells me that change happens through one way and will always happen through one way, and it is through the people. It is through the movement of the people who, the reason that the church is motivated through, as I mentioned before, through the unmarked graves, that took hundreds of thousands of people over decades to do that work, to never give up on those lost children. It also took people turning away from the church, and that the fact that the church was losing membership, which is why the Vespers message is we need to bring the church to the people instead of expecting them to come to the church. Because the church is dying in many communities across. We're talking about that at dinner time. The Catholic Church is dying, and I can tell you that highly problematically, other evangelicals are filling in the gaps in communities and bringing violence. And I think that the church has a responsibility to not give up on communities simply because there might be a financial issue. Because the Catholic Church is rich, rich, rich with land, with resources, and is one of the biggest fundraising bodies in the country, and needs to help support communities, particularly the communities that are vulnerable to being preyed upon by those entities that might not always be looking out for their best interests. And so my message is that I think that the church consistently gets in its own way. But here's what I can say is that I believe in people, and I really believe that when people see injustice, and they can see it, and I mean, like, I often think that people can't think that what is injustice is justice, and when they can see that it's injustice, it's easy to recognize, especially when you do the heavy lifting. And so I hope that Catholics can stand up for your own faith. Stand up for your own institution, because I think there are many people who are willing to stand with you. I'm one of them. But we need Catholics to stand up and not be indifferent to the plaguing of your own faith, which is at times that there are sexual abusers amongst your midst, there are corruption in your midst, and sometimes those are the highest elements of your institution, and that we need you to stand up. We need you to stand with us who believe that the church has value in our communities. That is a huge footprint in Indigenous communities, which is why I care so much. Okay. I'm not really the right person to answer this, but I would just say that I see Catholics growing and changing. Like, I was telling people at dinner that that the most amount of people who bring me out to talk now, since the pandemic, since the 215 and the 700 in Cowessus, I am overwhelmingly booked by Catholic entities now. And I'm not alone. There are hundreds of other people who are booked to speak and to share and to spend time. I think people should understand that many of us don't trust the church, and so it takes us a long time to be able to trust an entity that has not really deserved or earned, or perhaps at times has facilitated an atmosphere of trust. And so, like, I got big shoulders. I'm a tenured guy. I got a big platform. I'm not the typical kind of body out there. I think people in local communities should be the people who should be be the first force that the church should be building those relationships with. I mean, I appreciate coming out. I also say that you should be talking with your local entities and trying to help and stand beside. So what I would say is that the church is moving, but I actually see it more from the bottom up than I ever see from the top down. Because the fact is that the church continues to resist paying out the legally mandated amount that was offered to survivors in the 2006 settlement agreement, continues to hold more stolen land than any other entity in the country, and I think Catholics should care about that. I think you should care that you sometimes worship on stolen land. And territorial acknowledgement is a good step in that direction, but like, we all want to talk about sharing land, and then we actually have to share the land. I had a very interesting experience today over at the Squamish development, and I had people, like, we were filming a kid's video. I do kids videos to help people understand basic things. Like, so today I was talking about economic development for Indigenous peoples, and so I was talking about the Squamish development. We thought that would be a nice place to film. I had people screaming at me because they're very angry about that development. And so that's very interesting. There's some interesting dynamics happening within Vancouver that I think people taking care of their own backyard and seeing what I think. I had a guy come up to me who said to me, I am very angry that my home has been invaded, that my way of life is under threat, and that this development I wasn't consulted about this development. And I said, do you see any irony here? So, like, you know, I think we got a lot of learning and we got a lot of talking to do. And anyways, so go ahead. Yeah. So the first idea, you got my vote, so maybe you can run for something. Because like I think we need innovative, my policy is this: egregious times require egregious solutions. And so we have to be creative. We have to imagine what the possibilities are, and then we need to go and pursue it. And we can do absolutely anything. And the idea of Indigenous-led solutions, I think oftentimes the country wants to move faster than what the infrastructure. I mean, colonialism isn't dealt with in a night, right? Or isn't dealt with in even a couple years. I'm right now working with a body that is really dealing with the big challenge on our communities, which is human resources. The critical epidemic in First Nations is the issue of human resources. That people, when they do get trained, or if they go to university or they go to college, or that they don't come home. And they're not encouraged to come home because society doesn't reward you to come home. In fact, it punishes you. To say, now you're going to go to a community that doesn't have a nursing station, so good luck if you break your leg, and good luck if you're going to go to a pothole roads, and good luck if your children are going to go to a chronically underfunded school. So my point is that we need to make sure that those communities are supported so that people are encouraged to go home, and that going home is a thing that everybody wins about. So that's the challenge, is that oftentimes we expect First Nations to be able to keep up with a ever-growing, technologically demanding society, but they might not have the infrastructure. So how do we make sure that they do? How do we ensure and we join with? So those are some of the answers that I think are active to deal with some of your comment there. But at the same time, what do I think, or what are some of the ways in which we can move forward in terms of urban spaces? Is that what you're talking about? Well, I can tell you this, that the most innovative, brilliant, win-win situation in this country is urban Indigenous-led development. And urban reserves, particularly when we're talking about the prairies. And urban reserves is the only solution that works to make everybody, like, you can't lose. You can't lose. And because what it creates is it creates a special and unique relationship between that First Nations, that urban environment in which people get a hockey rink, a pharmacy, a shopping mall, and that the First Nations has economic opportunity, and the local city gets development in ways that they have otherwise not gotten from the private industry, who, by the way, doesn't care about the city. Because how do I know that? Because big block stores from Texas and Sweden, geez, who am I talking about, will abandon you the first second that you don't pay. Do you know who will never abandon you? First Nations. Ever. They will stay. This is our territory. They are 100% committed to staying here. And oh, by the way, when they make every penny, where are they reinvesting it? Here's a hint, not Texas. They are investing 100%. The most smartest economic development project is that when you build Indigenous economic development zones within a city, could be an urban reserve, maybe it's an Indigenous run business like it is in Winnipeg. My First Nation owns the horse track. Every penny goes in Winnipeggers' pockets, either in tax dollars, helping to fix potholes, paying for garbage collection to the site. Like, Winnipeggers win 100%, and they get a horse track. You like that kind of thing? And what is the new urban development in Winnipeg? You're getting a hockey rink, you're getting a water park. Winnipeggers apparently like water parks. And you're getting, like, the most Winnipegger of Winnipeg things, A little strip mall. Cannabis? Here's my point, is that like everybody wins. When Indigenous communities win, Canada wins. But when Canada wins, it's often at the cost of Indigenous peoples. So think about that formula for just a minute. If we invested, every single one of us, and got our city councils, our provincial governments, our federal governments to commit to building Indigenous infrastructure, Indigenous economic opportunities, Indigenous business, Indigenous any community, Canadians would always win, 100% of the time. But if Canadians win, it's often at the cost of Indigenous peoples, leaving them behind, taking the land forcibly, forcing through pipelines. Like, there's a method here that is not working, and let's try the other way, an egregious solution for an egregious problem. Okay, so number one is there are people in your parish who would never come to a night like this, have a conversation like this, because probably of conditioned ignorance. So every Canadian, and I include myself in that, you know, every single person in this country has been conditioned and encouraged to be ignorant, has been conditioned and taught to think things around division, and the biggest and most powerful story is Canadian superiority and Indigenous inferiority. We've all been taught that. And we were taught that consciously, like in textbooks, or subconsciously in like standing for the national anthem, but for no other song in our life. So we are encouraged to think of Canadian superiority, Indigenous inferiority. These things are changing. They are slow, but they are changing. My father was honored at the Winnipeg Jets game the other night. They sang "O Canada" in Cree. They had Métis jiggers throughout the entire night. Absolutely, the Jets wore an Indigenous logo. Like, these things are changing in very small and important ways in our community. We need to go beyond that. And so the hard conversations will never be on a night like this, because as somebody said to me earlier, you're going to be literally preaching to the choir, because if you've chosen to come tonight, you are already friendly to the message that I'm going to give, which is like, we're all human beings. Like, it's not a crazy message that I have, but for some sectors of our communities, and I'm going to bet your parish, and like all parishes, that's your parish is not an anomaly, I'm sure. There are sections of our communities in which there's still a large segment of Canadians who do not think Indigenous peoples are human beings. They're not going to say that. What they're going to do is say things like, oh, they don't work hard enough, or they're lazy, or they, you know, I came from Ukraine and I worked my butt off, and why can't they just work harder? Not aware that there are laws that stop that, that there are attitudes that stop that, that there's entire infrastructures that built on Indigenous failure. And so having that conversation. But then the second thing is, you're going to go away tonight and you're going to go, oh, well, I disagree with Niigaan on this thing, or Niigaan said this one thing and I'm curious about it, or hey, I want to know more. So go out and do your research and come up with a, you know, one of the things I love doing, one of my favorite things to do is I go to churches, or I go to community groups, or I just spend time having coffee. So it's not like a formal presentation like this. So start to have those infrastructure that you set up for yourself, so you're having consistent conversation with collective knowledge sharing, right? That is the most critical step. And then ask questions to yourself, like, hey, you know, like, let's talk about this one issue, and have a frank conversation about it. And also realize that we're all coming to this thing learning. So it's not about like trying to call somebody out when they make a mistake. It's just going, it's safe to talk about things here, and that's okay. And we're not all going to get it perfect right away. But the one thing that if we choose silence, we will be succeeding where residential schools failed. And what I mean by that is silence is what the story of Canadian superiority, Indigenous inferiority wants us to do. They want us to not talk about it. That's what the Pope said. The most Catholic thing you can do is not be indifferent. Just talk, and don't be afraid of making a mistake. And I can tell you this, that I will always step beside somebody who's brave. And if they're trying to say something like today, you know that guy that came and yelled at me? I said, well, tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me why you don't like this development. And by the end of the conversation, I knew his name, I knew where he comes from, and I didn't agree with him, and he didn't agree with me, but I certainly had a relationship with the guy at the end. And he wasn't yelling at me anymore. In fact, we shook hands at the end, and he smiled and said, I really appreciate that you listened to me. And here's the third thing is, so you're going to get, things are going to call to you. Like creation has this beautiful ability of giving you opportunity when you start to ask questions and talk. You'll be like, hey, there's this thing that needs to be done over there. Or, hey, there's this group over here that needs socks collected for those working in a community in our city where there's a high Indigenous population. I work for the Mama Bear Clan, so I'm always saying to people, Winnipeg's minus 40. We need gloves every day. Like I need parishes, I need communities, I need churches, church groups to go and collect gloves, like today. Sew them, knit them, go buy them at the dollar store, I don't care. We need to save people's hands in Winnipeg. Like that's the most crucial thing. Like it goes even beyond food, it goes beyond even a place to stay. We need to save their hands, like minus 50, man. And so that's what I would say is something's gonna call to you. I can't tell you what that is, but it's gonna come out of your conversations. And then answer it. Anytime anybody ever questions the unmarked graves, just ask them, did children die at the schools? Yes or no? End of conversation. Whether it's 1 or 50,000, do we think that it's okay that children died at the schools? Period. And then ask yourself this question, is if you saw a crime, experienced a crime, and you had somebody come up and say, I don't believe you, can you ever have a useful conversation with that person about anything? Instead of starting with no, why don't we start with I believe you? Because the fact is children died at the schools and that's indisputable. And so, you know what, the deniers, which my colleague Sean Carlton is like the national expert on this. So check out his Twitter, he does amazing work. He works at the University of Manitoba, Sean Carlton. He's from here, by the way, like we stole him from BC, brought him to Manitoba, because Indigenous Center of Winnipeg. Anyways, he remarks and points out that what drives denialism is what he calls nitpickiness. I'm not sure if that's the exact word that he used, and that's what denialisms is just rampant about, is that there was the media, which was not Indigenous, it was often like, national reporters who meant well, used the term mass grave. And so there are certain elements, National Post, who then went, oh, see, it's not true then, because there's no mass graves like was in Nazi Germany. Who cares whether there was bodies in a pile or bodies separate? There were children that died at the schools, period. Period. And then if people go, oh, well, it was tuberculosis epidemic. Well, it's because the ventilation of the schools were such that they encouraged disease to travel rapidly. So that tells you that there was absolutely a mental intent to harm children if you inappropriately build a building. Like for instance, if I built you a building and I'm a contractor and that building collapses on you, am I responsible? 100% I am, the law says so. But yet somehow we're like, well, see, that just shows you that it was just tuberculosis. No, the issue is that the church is 100% responsible for the deaths of every single child, and whether it's 1 or 50,000, I don't care. It's dead children. And we should not be okay with that. So we got to stop, anyways, got me all riled up. It's because anyone who denies it is simply nitpicky and absolutely trying to put a glaze over their own internal guilt. It has nothing to do with the church. It has everything to do with soothing their own feelings of trauma. And so what I do is I feel sorry for those people. I feel sorry for those people for wanting to live in ignorance because the rest of us are ready for truth. And I think that we should be kind to people who are feeling so much pain that they want to believe in a lie. We need more astute people like you going around and giving talks, because I think that Catholics really need to hear that message. So I travel to all the national events, right? Not all of them, but most of them. The most impactful thing that I ever heard, and I heard it consistently at every national event involving residential school survivors, is they didn't care about their relationship with the church or the government. They went, I'm not here to reconcile with the government or reconcile with the church or reconcile with the police or reconcile with the priests that harm me, or like, I'm not interested in any of that. What I am interested in is I want to reconcile with my kids. The pain that I brought home from the schools infected my life, made me incapable of parenting, made me share things with my children that I didn't want to share, and that I feel tremendous pain over that. So that tells you something very significant, that reconciliation will always be about healthy relationships, and that relationship doesn't always involve harm, those who have been harmed and those who have harmed, those who have experienced harm, those who have harmed. You know what I think Indigenous peoples seek out of reconciliation? Like, if you go universally and you say, okay, what is it Indigenous peoples seek? It will never be money. Like, that's not what Indigenous peoples are seeking. However, that's what the country offers. And so if that's the only method for justice, then Indigenous peoples are absolutely, they got to pay the bills. They also deserve, because if the system says the way you get justice is through monetary compensation, then that's the way the system works. We either believe in the system or we don't. And it shouldn't be about going, okay, well, you're Indigenous, and so therefore you're only going to get $10,000 for experience, the common experience payment, or $2,000 for every year of schooling. I guarantee if those are non-Indigenous peoples, they're making millions. And so it's not about that. I don't think Indigenous peoples, I could complain about the amount of funds that survivors were offered, but I can tell you this, that every single Indigenous person, what they want is their children to be safe, for their children to be comfortable and have access to food and safe communities to live in. To perhaps live in a world in which stereotypes and racism, and that my daughter, who is a young Anishinaabe Kwe, she's gonna go away to school and university next year. I'm scared to death, not so much about her university life, I'm scared about police. I'm scared about the people she's going to meet. I'm scared about all the different people who might have stereotypes about Indigenous peoples and will say something terrible or maybe do something terrible. I'm scared about that. And so I want to live in a society in which my children and your children can be safe, loved, and cared for. They also got to have air to breathe. They got to have food to eat. They got to have water to drink. So reconciliation, as we've just discovered for Indigenous peoples, it is actually about God, because we don't think of God as the being over there. We think of God as right here. We think of God as Gije Manado, the great mystery that we are all a part of. The best way I can ever describe God to you from an Indigenous sense is that it's like being in water or immersing yourself in water. You are both surrounded by water, but you are also water. And so there's a reason that in every creation story of every Indigenous nation, we are created from the elements of the earth, and that we are created from Gije Manado, or the creator, or God, or whatever the term is that's used, and that every element is a part of us. So that we are both water, we are earth, we are rock, we are plant, we are all of those parts. And that's why our clan system, our languages, our ceremonies are intricately tied with the place in which we are birthed. And so that means that reconciliation ultimately is about breathing, it's about eating, it's about drinking, and it's about love. And so is that about God? I would say yes. Is that about human? Yes. It's also, though, kind of about the future, and it's about the past. It's about the non-humans, it's about the humans. And all of those things are really what reconciliation is ultimately all about. It's not about going, okay, I've now recognized that this harm has happened, and God, who's over there, which I actually don't think is a Christian teaching anyways. That's a very kind of, that's one based in a whole lot of power and a whole lot of problems. But like God isn't over there, God is right here. God is a part of us, and I think isn't that what Jesus said? Isn't that a Jesus thing? Anyways, that's a terrible way to end, but I will end it that way. So there you go. So miigwech.
Well, I'm so glad we had this long question period, because I don't know if I could have spoken right after that powerful talk. You have told the truth. In telling the truth, you love us. Thank you. There's no way we can go away indifferent, am I right? So we need to bring that everywhere we go. And our center will make that commitment that we will continue this work on truth and reconciliation. Thank you. We have a small gift for you. Not as great as the gift you brought us, but it does include a t-shirt from our Pope Francis conference of Pope Francis. And I know that you're very fond of him.
Is that a thumbs up? Actually, I have to say hello to a few people. My daughter Sarah's watching on Dynamite. My friend Brittany's watching right now. My friend Kelly's watching right now. Anyways, look what I got, which is Pope Francis with a... Is that a thumbs up? That's so awesome. Right there.
Will you please join us after? We have refreshments in Plato's Cave, which is outside and to the right. So please join us and thank Dr. Niigaan Sinclair again. And please keep in touch with us so that we can continue to bring speakers. Whether they're always this powerful, I don't know that I can promise that. But let's thank him one more time.